Just before I start, I just want to say thank you to Peter and New Culture Forum. I don't know if people know, but I'm raising money for my legal fees, and I've had a huge amount of donations and messages of support from New Culture Forum listeners and members. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you and anybody that's reached out to me. So thank you. Okay, so the NHS. The NHS is the biggest employer, not just in the UK, but in the whole of Europe, and currently employs around 1.3 million people. It's actually the 5th biggest employer in the world, losing out to 4th place to McDonald's. So it's big. It's also young. This year will see it celebrate its 75th anniversary. Yet the way it's embedded into our national consciousness, the envy of the world, it almost feels like it's been around forever. The NHS is also free at the point of use. Except, of course, it's not. It's something we all have to pay for. Referred to as some as the socialist NHS, or the national religion, we've seen over the last few years, especially, and by that I mean the pandemic years, that what the NHS says and does, the messages, guidance, and regulations it promotes, ends up having a massive impact on all our lives. It's imperative then that when the NHS is increasingly being taken over by woke dogma and identity politics, that its staff and patients speak up about it, and many of us have. But why has this woke takeover happened? Well, being the biggest employer in Europe also means that the NHS is the biggest employer of equality, diversity, and inclusivity officers, positions, and trainings. A recent report published at the end of last year by Conservative Way Forward found that 10,000 EDI roles in the NHS are costing the UK taxpayer £550 million a year, as well as 1 million working days lost. To put that into some context, the money saved from those EDI positions could fund around 12,500 nurses, or increase the pay of nurses who, we found out last week, will be striking again after rejecting the government's recent increased pay offer. So, we have top-down, widespread EDI officers preaching to a compassionate staff group who are driven by a desire to care for others. While being compassionate and caring are, of course, admirable qualities, it may also mean that the NHS staff are more easily seduced by ideologies that claim to be about protecting the vulnerable in the face of injustice and oppression. And it is specifically in my field of healthcare, mental health, which seems to have become the most captured, finding itself at the sharp end of the culture wars. Surely those trained to recognise delusion and hysteria would be the first to push back against woke insanity. No, unfortunately not. Quite the opposite. This is because so much of critical social justice, or woke, relies on the use, or rather misuse, of psychological language and concepts. Demands for trigger warnings and safe spaces weaponise the notion of concern for psychological harm in order to shut down and control different and perfectly valid points of view. Listening, empathising with others, and understanding another person's experience has been taken to the extreme, whereby so-called lived experience and my truth cannot even be questioned. Furthermore, we've seen the rollout of unconscious bias trainings, despite being debunked and shown to potentially reduce workplace harmony and increase tension. And then we get to the politics of identity, namely that of gender and race. Gender ideology promises psychological self-actualization and the prospect of becoming your authentic, true self by being affirmed into the gender that you truly are. And yet, the psychiatric diagnosis of gender dysphoria, a description of the symptoms of a mental illness, has got lost in the amorphous identity marker of trans. Similarly, critical race theory tells us that racism is worse than ever and that no true progress has been made. This is despite the gains of the civil rights movements, the overwhelming evidence of reduction of true racist sentiment, and studies which show that Britain is one of the most tolerant places on earth. So how can the critical race theorists come to the conclusions that they do? Well, because according to them, racism is just as prevalent as it ever was, but it's just been driven into the deep recesses of our unconscious minds. During my psychotherapy training at the now infamous Tavistock Clinic, I was told that it's specifically the so-called white mind that harbours these racist sentiments. When I pointed out that claiming to know what is going on in a person's mind based on the colour of their skin is racist, and that making negative generalisations about an entire race of people is also racist, I was told that I needed to do the work of anti-racism and interrogate whiteness. The Tavistock, an NHS organisation, claimed to be an anti-racist organisation, but instead they act as though they are anti-thinking. They have outsourced all their thinking about race and identity to Robin DiAngelo, author of the book White Fragility. Here, Angelo claims that white people are all racist, and those that disagree are exhibiting a form of mental fragility. In fact, if you disagree with her claims about race in any way, you are simply employing a psychological defence mechanism to avoid facing the truth. Critical thinking, debate, evidence, the Socratic method of dialogue must all be squashed to make way for divine revelation. This is a fake, fraudulent form of psychology. It does not represent genuine clinical psychology or psychotherapy in any way. And what happens when genuine, evidence-led, outcome-based psychology is replaced with ideology? In 2021, a former patient at the Tavistock's Gender Identity Service, Kira Bell, challenged the use of puberty blockers for 16-year-olds, a treatment she herself was given as a teenager and later regretted. Her case went all the way to the High Court and would later lead to the CAS review, an independent review into the treatment of gender dysphoria. The findings of which showed many of us what we already knew, that the approach was narrow and affirmative rather than exploratory, that assessment was not standardised and not conducted comprehensively, safeguarding processes were lacking, and gender dysphoria was attended to without taking into account any coexisting diagnoses. The CAS review also made the point of stating that social transition, for example, accepting a child's new pronouns or preferred name, is not a neutral act, and the implications of doing this are not known. Alongside the CAS review, the Tavistock Clinic also faced legal challenge from its staff, whistleblowers who were bullied and faced disciplinary proceedings for speaking out. The safeguarding lead, Sonia Appleby, won an employment tribunal and was awarded compensation for reputational damages. So, how much impact has all of this had on keeping gender ideology and woke ideology more broadly out of healthcare and in the NHS? So from my current anecdotal experience, sadly, I'd say not that much. The so-called affirmative model is still being followed in many cases. However, I do notice notice the way there seems to be a bit of a slight shift. I remember 5 or 6 years ago, clinicians announcing that a patient was trans with jubilation and exclaiming how brave they were for deciding to transition. I don't hear things like that so much anymore. Staff seem slightly more cautious about the matter. But there is still a culture of silence and difficulty asking questions. When a patient is described as being trans, there's an extraordinary lack of questioning and a curious look, a slight crease in the brow of those on the receiving end of this term. What does it mean? Does it mean the patient, the adult or young person, has been through medical or surgical transition? Does it mean they're about to go through medical or surgical transition? Does it mean they dress as though they are of the opposite sex to what they are? Does it mean they have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria? More often than not, in my experience, it actually doesn't mean any of these things. Trans can mean anything you like. Surely it would be useful and necessary to clarify what it is we are actually talking about. Surprisingly not. Nobody seems to want to have a discussion. And by that I don't mean a philosophical discussion, I mean just a purely facts-based information gathering discussion about what it is we're talking about. Assessing children and adolescents in A&E, I've had difficulty locating the patient I'm going to assess as I've been simply told they're non-binary, so I'm able to confirm whether they're male or female. Similarly, more recently, the trust I work for sent an invitation to an anti-racism workshop. One of the sessions was titled Internalized Racism, followed by the qualifier that this workshop was for BAME staff only, so black and ethnic minority staff only. Putting aside the very confusing notion of internalised racism, isn't the idea that only black and Asian people suffer from this pseudo-diagnostic criterion a bit presumptuous and patronising to them? And isn't excluding me from attending something because I'm not BAME a bit, well, racist to me? Exclusion in the name of inclusion. But fear not, I don't want to demoralise you all too much. There is hope. There are signs of a transition, a healthy transition that's occurring. More and more psychologists, therapists, and clinicians are coming together to speak up. I myself am taking a stand by taking legal action after I was bullied and suspended for disagreeing with critical race theory. And there's also another pending lawsuit from a talking therapist, James Esses, who was, like me, suspended from his training course. His crime was raising concerns about gender ideology. Hopefully my case and his can have further impact with regards to how we think about these issues. And more recently, we have the publication of two very important books. Firstly, Hannah Barnes' book, Time to Think, the inside story of the collapse of the Tavistock's gender service, an extraordinary and very rare example of true journalism in which she lays bare the failings and devastating impact of ideological capture of the NHS. And the second book I'd like to draw attention to is a book called Cynical Theories, Perspectives on the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice. I've got it here, I'm just going to hold it up so people can be familiar with how it looks. This is it's first of its kind. It's a collection of essays drawn together from psychologists, therapists, and clinicians who are using their skills and expertise to think about and open up conversations about the dangers of woke ideology and the dangers it poses to mental health. And we actually have one of its authors, Carol Sherwood, in the audience today. Alongside this publication, there's a growing organisation, Critical Therapy Antidote, who are bringing together like-minded clinicians to talk about and discuss all of the aforementioned issues and topics without fear of being cancelled. So it appears that clinicians of all political persuasions are starting to realise that the very conservative ethos and oath, first do no harm, is of immense value and one that ought to be returned to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Have we got any questions for Amy? Yes, a gentleman here with the brown shirt in that row there.
Yeah, my name's Howard, chromosomes XY. I had a question about, I used to teach psychology, and years ago in the 1970s, the whole thing with transgender was debunked, I think, with the John Money study with Brian Richards. I just wondered, how is that considered now? Why does nobody hark back to that now with the modern academic?
Yeah, that's not talked about at all. Being a student in the Tavistock, even what's currently going on at the Tavistock is not talked about. So the idea that you would be talking about John Money is no, it's not even coming close. I was at the Tavistock when the outcome of the Sonia Appleby case came through, and when the High Court proceedings were in the press, and when it was eventually decided that the Tavistock Clinic, or the Gender Identity Clinic, would be shut down, and it was not talked about. It was just like it was completely absent, which is extraordinary from people whose profession is about talking about things and wanting to be open. It's quite extraordinary.
Is it gentleman over there in the blue?
Thanks to Peter and NCF for this great day. I have a question for Amy and also perhaps a suggestion for everybody else here. Last autumn I had some surgery on my knee, and before I was admitted, I was asked if I was pregnant.
Oh, no.
And the thing that occurred to me since was that actually, if I had said yes, I am, and encouraged all other men going through the same question to say the same, then we could fairly quickly make a complete mess of their statistics.
Yes.
Thank you. Lady here, got the lady here, just that's the blonde hair. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Carol Sherwood. I'm one of the authors of the book that Amy's very
right.
kindly given us.
Great.
Amy, I'd just like to thank you, I'm sure on behalf of all of us, for putting your career on the line to stand up to woke.
Yeah.
You and I know only too well, Amy, don't we, what the dangers of this ideology creeping into mental health services is going to have for patients. If you think about, I mean, all of us will have had these experiences. We will have witnessed the slurs, the racial slurs against people who dissent, the accusations of white psychosis, you know, the humiliation that I think Matt talked about earlier on. It should be nowhere near a therapy room. And yet what is happening, and I know this personally because I'm a clinical psychologist and I've carried out a study into this, all the clinical psychology training courses in the UK now are encouraging their students to be social justice activists. This means that when you go to a therapy room and you are vulnerable in your mental health, you are going to be either labelled as privileged or labelled as oppressed. And if you're labelled as privileged, then you will be given a moral re-education. And if you are labelled as oppressed, you will be encouraged to become a political activist. I'm not making this up, this is happening in the States. This is happening in the States. Now, Amy, I'd just like you, can you tell us a little bit more about what patients might expect if this is rolled out into mental health services in the NHS?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as you well know, Carol, that within nursing and within psychology, the things that you're taught all the way through, or used to be taught, is neutrality, that you are there to help whatever person is sat in front of you, and you're to treat them as an individual and to not make assumptions. We've now completely flipped so that we're going in the complete opposite direction of that. I think what's happening, there's a few things that are happening, but clinicians themselves who are buy into critical social justice are themselves becoming very sensitive, very emotional, and they are themselves not fit to see patients. And they're trying to encourage their patients to see the world in the way that they see it, which means essentially you've got therapists and patients colluding with each other, encouraging each other's depression, encouraging each other's own worldview, and not lifting someone up to feel better, but giving them reasons to stay in their resentment and the depression and so on, and to tell them that actually these strong emotions they're feeling are valid and that they should act on them and not think around them. Patients won't get better. I mean, we know that there's evidence-based treatments that are the best, that work, and those evidence-based treatments are being labelled as patriarchal, white supremacist, and even the whole idea of evidence-based practice is seen as white supremacist. So you will have lunatics in charge of the asylum, basically. It's totally mad. I mean, it's maddening to be on the receiving end of. I'm quite lucky. I feel that all my training is what's made me be able to manage this, because I'm able to think about what might be going on in the mind of not the patients, but the staff that are pushing this. That's not something I thought I'd have to do when I first started out.
One more question for the gentleman there's had his hand up for ages. One more, because we have to crack on.
Yeah, that brief passage you spoke there reminded me of cognitive behavioural therapy, which is, as many people know, a practical, pragmatic response to mental health issues. So do you think that treatments such as that will be taking a sideline in future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of good work around thinking about cognitive behavioural therapy and how so much of woke ideology is the complete opposite, that it's encouraging emotional reasoning, it's encouraging generalizations, it's encouraging jumping to conclusions, it's encouraging black and white thinking, which is all the tenets that CBT claims to help people move away from. In terms of will CBT, I mean, I am also seeing woke ideology, unfortunately, take over CBT as well. I'm seeing CBT and clinicians talking about identity a lot with their patients. I don't know how they can't see that some of the things they're saying is so contradictory to what CBT is. I think different modalities, psychotherapy, CBT, and so on, they're often quite competitive, but what I'm seeing is that none of them have stood the test of standing up to what's happening. Really, I can't point at one and say, that they're the ones that really have resisted all of this. It seems to be everywhere, unfortunately. Yeah.
Amy, thank you very, very much. I would like to I'd like to sort of say actually as well that, when we often list a catalogue of all the things that are going wrong, along comes somebody or something which actually totally rebalances it and shows indeed why we should have faith. And Amy Gallagher is one of those. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.